Hey friends, hope you're all doing well out there. Today I'd like to talk to you about a PowerShell module that Microsoft have recently made generally available, and it's called Crescendo. So I've followed this a little bit through its preview release stage, just reading a few blogs about it and catching a video here or there, but I didn't get hands-on with it myself until today actually. So I've spent a few hours just having a look at it, and I thought I'd share my learnings with you. So I've put together a short slide deck, it's only a couple of slides. We'll go through what Crescendo is, why you might be interested in it, and then we'll jump into the lab, we'll get hands-on, and I'll show you what I've learnt today. Let's go. PowerShell Crescendo. Let's just spend a few minutes here in the slides and we'll talk through what it is, and then we'll jump into the demo in a hands-on lab. So firstly, what is PowerShell Crescendo? First and foremost, it's a tool to help develop PowerShell commandlets for any command line based tool. Now you might be sitting there thinking, yeah, no, okay, I can write a PowerShell commandlet that can wrap around another executable file, maybe something like robocopy.exe or the Docker command line, which is what we're going to work with today actually. But Crescendo is a little bit more than that, and you don't necessarily need to be writing those PowerShell commandlets themselves, and that will make sense more as we work our way through here. It provides object-based output, which is probably the biggest difference when working with any command line tool. So yeah, you can open up PowerShell on your computer and launch any command line tool, no problems at all. But when you get output back from those tools, it is just text on the screen. It is not that native PowerShell object-based response that we're used to, and then we can do something with that object. We'd first have to transform that text that came back and then work from there. The difference here with Crescendo is we get an opportunity to manipulate the text that's coming back from that native command line tool and make it an object in PowerShell. That is really powerful. You can also do privilege elevation with Crescendo, and there's some integrated help as well. So you can go through and write things like the description and comment-based help that we're used to for parameters and things like that. And Crescendo will go and make sure that they are in the end result PowerShell module that gets produced by Crescendo. So there are two main components to this, and the big one is that there is a JSON configuration file, and that is really what holds all this thing together. You, as the developer of these commandlets, are primarily working with this JSON configuration file. So this is where you will define everything that the new commandlets will be able to do, what the parameters are, what the underlying command line tool is that's being run when you execute these new commandlets. Everything goes in that JSON file. Now the other main component ties back to that object-based output. So there's a thing called an output handler, and that is effectively this thing that sits in between the command being run by that native command line tool and PowerShell itself. So the output handler there is running PowerShell functions to do whatever you need to do to convert the output coming back from that native tool into objects in PowerShell. And honestly, from what I've seen so far, the output handler is probably where you'll end up spending most of your time if you do go down the path of using Crescendo to create modules. I'm a visual person, so let me just lay this out conceptually for you as well, and hopefully this will all make sense. Now, let's imagine that we've got a user over here on the left, and this is a user who is creating modules using Crescendo. So they're probably a bit more of an advanced PowerShell user, and they've got some command line tools that they want to integrate into PowerShell and make native PowerShell commands for. That is their goal, and that is what they are going to use Crescendo for. And then over there on the right-hand side, we've got another user, and they are just consuming modules that have been produced by Crescendo itself. And that user on the right-hand side, they don't necessarily need to know anything about Crescendo at all. They don't need to understand the JSON file or how these are being built. They just need to get given the modules that are created from Crescendo, and they can go and work with that from PowerShell version 5.1 and onwards. So bouncing back over here to this user on the left, they would use the Microsoft.PowerShell.Crescendo module to actually go and create these new PowerShell commandlets. And the way this works is that you can use some commandlets inside of that module to create a JSON file from a schema. Now you don't need to do that. You could just use a JSON file from an example that's online, or maybe a previous one that you've used if you start creating a few of these different modules. But just know there is a command in that module there that can create the JSON file for you, and I'll show you that in a demo. When you've got the JSON file, you then need to configure it to run an underlying command line tool. And in my example here that we're going to go through, that command line tool that we're going to use is docker.exe, or the Docker command line interface. Now just remember there, that could be any command line based tool. That's the goal of this, right? Is to take any command line based tool and create some PowerShell modules that wrap around it and transform some of the output coming back so that we've got PowerShell modules and we've got that consistency that PowerShell gives us as well, like the verb-noun naming, all of the help and the parameters. That's what we're working towards here. So once we've gone and configured that JSON file to do all of the different things that we need it to do, we then use another command in the Crescendo module to read back in that JSON file, and then we go and create a custom PowerShell module. And inside of that custom PowerShell module are the commandlets that we've created and defined inside of the JSON file. So for me, that might be things like get-docker container, stop-docker container, and start-docker container. Now under the hood, they are just going to be calling the Docker command line to go and perform all of the things. But as someone consuming these modules, you don't really need to know that it's doing that. Me, as someone who has authored this module through Crescendo for you, I've done all of the hard work of making these nice commandlets with all of the parameters. And if you're familiar with PowerShell, you are immediately familiar with all of these commandlets as well. So that user on the right-hand side, all they really need to get their hands on is that custom PowerShell module. And of course, they do actually need the underlying application that's being called as well. So that person running these commandlets, they would need the PowerShell module there on the right-hand side, and they'd also need, in this instance, Docker to be installed on their machine. What are we going to do here in the next few minutes? Well, first of all, we'll install Crescendo. Now, I've actually already done that, but I'll show you how to do that. It's pretty straightforward as per any modules with PowerShell. We'll go and review a couple of the native Docker commands. So I want to show you what we're trying to do here and what the raw commands are and what they output by default. We'll then create a Crescendo JSON configuration to build a new get-docker container commandlet. So the goal here is to have a PowerShell module which has a single commandlet in it called get-docker container, and that is going to call the Docker command line interface. Then once we've got that going in a pretty basic format, we'll jump back into the JSON configuration and I'll go and modify the output and I'll add on a parameter just to take it to that next level so you can start to see how some of the JSON configuration impacts the end result here. Some of the prerequisites, if you want to follow along, you do need PowerShell 7.0 or higher to be authoring Crescendo. So you only need 5.1 or higher to be able to run the modules that are produced by Crescendo. But if you want to do the authoring like I'm going to be doing, you do need PowerShell 7 or higher. And then of course, you do actually need a command line tool to amplify. And amplify is Microsoft's wording of what we're doing here. So we're taking a command line tool and we are amplifying it by wrapping it in PowerShell and giving it all of that PowerShell goodness. And like I've said a few times now, I will be using Docker in this demo, but you are more than welcome to use any command line tool that you have available. Let's jump into Visual Studio Code and into the PowerShell. All right, let's get stuck straight in here. So the first couple of lines that I've got up the top there are just for installing Crescendo. Now I've already done this myself, so we could do install-module to install PowerShell Crescendo, or if you're using the new PowerShell Get version 3, you can use this one here of install-ps resource, Microsoft.PowerShell Crescendo, and potentially if you want to, you can do a reinstall. That's only really relevant if you've already had it installed, but it doesn't hurt to have it on there either. Now what I want to do first is just show you the native Docker commands that we are going to then transform into PowerShell commandlets. So the first one is pretty straightforward, well actually both of them are, but this one is just doing a Docker container list. So let me highlight that and we'll run that there in PowerShell. And the result that we get back is that I've got one Docker container running at the moment on my machine, and that result just came back as text in the PowerShell console there down the bottom. Pretty much exactly what I expected. Let me just clear the screen there. And then the next command down is exactly the same again, except on the end here, we have the --all option. And what that means when running Docker container list is that it will show both running and not running containers. So let's run that line there. And we'll see this time it's wrapped around there, so it is a little bit hard to see actually, but we've got two Docker containers back. We've got this first one here, which is Nginx, and then we've got this second one here, which is a Docker getting started container. Now, the interesting thing with this second one is that it has been exited 7 hours ago. So that second container is not running, and that's why it didn't show up in that first command of Docker container list, because that will only show running containers. I wanted to use this --all option because I do want to show you when we get to Crescendo how to make a PowerShell parameter call an underlying native option on a command line interface, like Docker container list. So let's move down here a little bit to get into some of the Crescendo configuration. So what we're doing here from lines 13 all the way down to 24 actually, is we're creating a configuration here inside of PowerShell, and then we're going to convert that configuration to JSON and then output it to a JSON file. So this is how we're using Crescendo itself to generate an initial JSON file that we can then work from. Now, if you've got an example already of a JSON file, or if you've created one of these before and you've got that handy, you don't need to go through this process necessarily, but if you're just getting started, this might be worth going through. Some of the most important things here probably to pay attention to are here on lines 18, 19, and 20. So up here on line 18, I'm setting the verb to get and the noun as Docker container. So what this is going to do when it creates the JSON file is this will create a commandlet that will eventually be a PowerShell commandlet, and this one will be called get-docker container. So following that standard PowerShell verb-noun naming. And down here on line 21, we've got original name. And this is where you provide the path on the machine to the underlying program that you want to run when you run the PowerShell commandlet that's getting built here. So I want to be running docker.exe, and that's located there down under C drive and in program files. So let's go and run this whole block here to go and create that JSON file. And we can see there on the left-hand side, I've now got docker.crescendo.json. That's not a naming scheme you have to follow by any means, but it is one that I just created. And in here, we'll see some things that we just created. So we've got the verb of get, the noun is Docker container, and the original name there is that path that we passed in. And then it's gone and built out the rest of this JSON file. There's no values in anything else here because we didn't provide any other values, apart from the schema that we've got down the bottom there for some validation. But we'll come back through just into a couple of these properties in a couple of minutes' time. So back over here in the PowerShell, as I scroll down a little, the next thing that I've got here is to use Crescendo to create a PowerShell module. So in here, we're going to run export-crescendo module, and we're going to pass it the configuration file, which is that JSON file that we literally just created a few moments ago. And the output of this command is going to be a PowerShell module. So then I'm giving it a module name, and I'm just calling this module docker.crescendo. So this here is actually where all the magic sauce happens. So let's run that, and that is going to go and look at that JSON file, look at all of the configuration that we've got in there, and then build us a PowerShell module. Now I'm just outputting this to the local directory that I'm in. So there on the left-hand side, you can see that we've now got a PSD1 file and a PSM1 file there as well, which are the standard files for a PowerShell module. Let me just clear the screen down the bottom there. So what we can do now is just import that module with a standard PowerShell import-module commandlet. So I'm going to pull in that new docker.crescendo module, and then I can use get-command to have a look at what is inside of that module. And we can see there, look at that, we have got a command inside of that module called get-docker container. So now let's go and run that commandlet that we've got, get-docker container, and we'll see what happens. Let me just make this a little bit bigger down here. And what's actually happened is what I expected, because I've already gone through this, but we didn't actually get the container like we were expecting. It hasn't gone and gotten us any information about the container. In fact, all it has run is the Docker command line interface. And why has it done that? Well, that's exactly what we've told it to do. In the JSON configuration back over here, we've just told it to execute docker.exe, and we haven't given it any command line arguments. So let's go and fix that up now. And where we do that in this JSON file is actually here under the original command elements. So let me just create an array in here. And then within this array, we need to pass through the arguments. So actually, if I go back over to my PowerShell and let's scroll back up to the top. So we had Docker container list. So back over in the JSON, we're already running Docker by calling it here. So now here in the elements, the first one that we need was container. And then the next one down that we needed was for list. So now when I compile this configuration using Crescendo, this command, get docker container, is going to call docker.exe with these elements down here, or these arguments. So it will say container and then list. So let's save that. We'll go back over here into PowerShell and let's try this out. What I need to do first is I'm going to do a bit of cleanup to remove the module from my session and remove those files there that were created. And let's go back up and we will export Crescendo module again from that saved JSON file. Perfect, we've got those there. Let's go ahead and import the module. And this time we will run get-docker container again. And there we go. This time we get the output of what would have normally been Docker container list. We are seeing that running Nginx container down there at the bottom. Perfect. That's pretty cool, right? But there's still a little bit of a problem with this. If I actually just grab that get-docker container, let's go down to the console here. I'm going to run that and just pipe it out to get member. And if I scroll all the way back to the top, you'll see here that the type is still a system.string. So that result that we're getting after just simply running get-docker container, while it is the right information, it's just a string to us here in PowerShell. So that hasn't gotten us much further than just running the native Docker command itself. So now let's go and we'll modify some of the output. So let me go and clean up those resources again to get it back out of the shell so that when we import it, it's all clean. And actually first what I want to do is I'm going to come up to Docker container list here. And I'm just going to show you something that I came across kind of in my research and my playing. So with any of the Docker commands, Docker does natively support outputting into a JSON format. And if you can do that with the command that you're using here, whether it's to JSON or XML or CSV or any of that structured data type, you are going to be a lot better off when you try and convert this into PowerShell objects because PowerShell can natively deal with a lot of those object types. But at the end of the day, if it's just outputting text, yes, you can still go and convert that in the Crescendo module, but it is going to be a lot more painful to write that handler that can take the output and create it as a PowerShell object. Anyhow, what we can do here with Docker is if I put a -- format on the end, we can then specify that we want this in the JSON format by going couple of brackets, JSON and a period and a couple of brackets. And actually, I think I might need that in quotes. And there we go. So that's the same output there, but now we've just got it in this JSON format. So wouldn't that be handy to build into our native PowerShell module that we're writing? So let's go and do that in the JSON file here. All we need to do to make that happen is actually add a few more elements here. So I'll just put a comma and we'll add another element, which will be -- format. And then we need another element after that, which was for the JSON argument itself. So that was a couple of brackets, JSON, a period, and a couple of closing brackets. Now that's all specific to Docker. That's nothing to do with Crescendo itself or PowerShell. But that there is from the Docker command line interface on how you get the output in a JSON format, which is exactly what we want here. So actually I was going to skip ahead there, but let me just save that. Let's run that and we'll see what happens. So we'll go back over to our PowerShell commands here. And let's run that export Crescendo module again, same one as before. We'll go and import the module into the PowerShell session. And this time we will go and run get Docker container again. And with any luck, we will now see the same output, but the JSON. And there we go. We have got a JSON response there. And now what you could do is you could run this commandlet. Let me clear the screen. We could run that commandlet and then pipe it across to convert from JSON. And if I could type, that would work a lot better. Convert from JSON, there we go. And this time, look at that. We have now gotten a JSON object back here in native PowerShell. Let me just scroll there so we can see that. Look at that, we can see here the image name is Nginx, then it's connected to the bridge network, it's running, and it's been up for 8 hours. Now this here is a proper PowerShell object that we can now go and do something else with. But we can actually take this a step further. Notice that I was still running the commandlet get -- Docker container, and then I had to do this conversion here. So I had to be aware that JSON was coming back and then go and do a conversion. But let's go back to the JSON file and we'll add one more thing in here where we can enhance this a little bit further. So let me scroll down, and what I'm looking for now are the output handlers. So this is where you use the JSON file for Crescendo to go and create an output handler. And the goal here is to kind of intercept that text that is coming back from the native command and then convert it into something PowerShell native. Now, because I've cheated a little bit and the underlying command is actually returning a JSON object, that does make it a lot easier here. So let's take a look. We'll go and create an array, and inside of that we need an object. And we should get some validation here as well. Yeah, we do. So the first thing we need is the parameter set name. So that is just a PowerShell default parameter set, if you're familiar with that concept. So I don't have really anything here, so we'll just assign this to the default parameter set. And the main thing that we need here is the handler. And this is effectively a string of PowerShell that you can run that is going to take that output from the underlying command and then do something with it. And I've just forgotten a comma up the top there, so let me fix that before I forget that. And one of the syntaxes you can use here, there's a few examples of this in the documentation, but I can just do an args and grab the first item there. And then I'm going to pipe that in here across to convert from JSON. So I'm now going to do that convert from -JSON commandlet here in the Crescendo configuration, which means that it will be built into that PowerShell commandlet. Let's go and run this and it should make sense. So I'll save that JSON file. Let me make this console a bit bigger and I'll clear the screen. Back over to our PowerShell here. Let's clean up all of that stuff again. We'll go and do the export Crescendo module again. Let's go and import that module in here to the console. And now we should be able to run get-docker container again. And remember, this time I don't want to see any raw JSON. I want to see a PowerShell object. And look at that, that is exactly what we've got. We've got that back in here as a PowerShell object. So I don't have to know that it's underlying JSON and I don't have to do that conversion. I've kind of taken care of all of that in the output handler in the Crescendo module itself. So if I scroll down here, what can we do with this now? That's right, we'll come back to all in a moment. We'll add a parameter on there. But what I want to show is if we do a get-docker container, I could now do a select object. I could pass that down the standard PowerShell pipeline and I could just select the names object. And there we go. It gets treated just like a normal PowerShell object because that's exactly what it is. So to kind of wrap up here, let's go and look at a parameter. And I'm just going to clean up the shell here before we get started on that. So let's remove all that again. And good. All right, let's get rid of that. We'll jump back across to the JSON file. So our goal here now is to call the underlying Docker command. So if I just scroll back up, we want to call docker.exe and we still want to do a container list. But this time we want the option to be able to list all containers because at the moment, this PowerShell commandlet here, get-docker container, it is only getting back the running containers. So to do that, we need to add a parameter. And that is found under the parameters section here. So we need to create a new object under here, and I should be able to use IntelliSense again. Now I'm only going to use a few of these properties here. There's obviously quite a lot that you can see in the IntelliSense, and these kind of all map back to native PowerShell parameter configurations that you can make if you were writing a PowerShell function or a PowerShell module kind of natively. So the first thing that I want to do is a name for this parameter, and I'm just going to call this one all. So that means when we run the PowerShell command, the parameter itself will just be -all. And the most important thing here potentially is the original name. So this is the original name of the underlying argument that we want to call when we use this parameter on the PowerShell command. So if you remember back, that was --all to get all of the containers when running that Docker command. For the next one, I want to enter in a parameter type here. And I want to set this one to a switch. It's just basically going to be there or not. We don't need to provide it a string of text or any values or anything like that. And let's just go and we can add a description in here. So let's say this will list all containers, including those that aren't running. Hopefully there's no spelling mistakes in there, but don't hold it to me if there are. All right, cool. I think we're looking good now. So let's just recap what we've got here. We're creating a PowerShell commandlet called get-docker container. Under the hood, that's going to run docker exe with the container list argument, and it's also going to format the output as JSON. If we choose to use it, we've got a parameter here for all, which will send a --all as an optional switch to that underlying command. And down here under the output handler, I'm intercepting that response that's coming back from the Docker command, and I'm doing a convert from JSON. So one last time here, let's go and save that JSON file. We'll go back over to the PowerShell where I've got the commands listed out. We'll clear the screen there. So let's go ahead and do the export-crescendo module. By the way, these are exactly the same commands that I'm running over and over here for the first few times, doing that same export. And then down here, we're going to import the module back into this session. And then let me just run get-docker container. We'll just make sure that that's still working. Yep, that looks good. That is just a single object. Let me make that a little bit bigger. So now what we want to do is a get-docker container, and we're going to do a -all. So that is just a standard PowerShell parameter. Let me go and run that one. And what we've got now, you probably didn't see it as it scrolled past there, but we've got two objects in the response there. We've got the first one, which is the Nginx container, which is, oops, sorry, I scrolled down a little bit fast there. So we've got the Nginx container here, which is currently running, and that's been up for 9 hours. But the next object down here is that Docker getting started image, and this one has exited 9 hours ago. So we are now using the -all parameter on the PowerShell command to send --all down through to that underlying Docker command that's being run in the Docker CLI. And similarly here, I could run -all, and I could do a select object on the names, and it's going to bring back 2 of those names because we've now got 2 objects coming back from the underlying command. And that is pretty much it. The last thing I did want to flag here before we wrap up is there is a get-help for about_crescendo that you can run. And when you run this, there is some information in here. Let me just make that kind of full screen. And I'm going to scroll up a little bit here just through this text. Sorry if this is hurting your eyes. But if you see the output handling here, so this is the example that I just showed you here. So grabbing the arguments and then doing a convert from JSON. Now, if you aren't lucky enough and your underlying command can only return a string value, then it is going to get a little more complicated. And you can see there's an example down here that I've scrolled to, which under the hood is running apt. But what they have to do here is intercept the response that's coming back, and then it's piping that to select object. And then they're doing some string manipulation here to get that data from a text response back into a PowerShell custom object. So the goal here is to always get a response back into a PowerShell object. We don't want responses coming back as strings, because if they are, we almost might as well have just ran the original underlying command from the native command line interface. I truly hope that has been helpful. Crescendo is fantastic. Make sure to give it a look. I loved playing with it here for a few hours today. I hope you've learned a thing or two in this clip here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.